difficult and arduous race. The Christian life is much the same way. We often take out of the gate strong, but we start to slow down and then we collapse. But rather we need to pace ourselves and to endure and to persevere and keep moving forward. If you've ever watched a televised marathon on TV, you'll see people near the end of a marathon that are barely even moving. They're taking small, labored steps, but they're still advancing. They never stop because they know that once they stop, they're done. They're finished. Our Christian life is much the same way. We have to endure. We have to persevere. And even if we're taking the minutest little baby steps, we always need to keep moving forward. We need to run with endurance. We need to be a people who aren't willing to give up, people who aren't willing to quit. Endurance is all about conditioning. We have to prepare ourselves for this race. We don't just wake up one day and decide to run it. And we have to exercise that endurance. We have to bring discipline into our lives in order to be able to accomplish it. The Apostle Paul wrote about this very thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The Apostle Paul said that I bring my body into subjection in order that I may complete my race. Paul said he didn't let his body dictate what his spirit did. He did not let his carnal desires, his fleshly desires, overcome his spiritual desire to continue on the path that Christ had laid before him. He knew that he was in a race. He knew that that race was lifelong and that it took endurance and perseverance. And he knew that his body would eventually quit and it would want to give up on him. He said that I don't allow my body to dictate to me. I bring it into subjection in order that I may finish my race. I do that as well. You do that as well. We have to bring our bodies into subjection to what we know that we are supposed to do. Because they will want to quit on us and they will want to distract us and they will want to give up. But our spiritual drive takes us through to the finish line. It increases our endurance. Every time we encounter a struggle, a difficulty, or a trial, as we persevere through that, we gain a little bit more endurance. We become a little more stronger. We become a little bit more disciplined. You know, I can remember several years ago, I went on a diet and I lost about 30 pounds. And the biggest thing that I was amazed by when that happened is how my endurance increased. I could do things longer than I could before when I was carrying around that extra weight. My endurance was increased because I had shed that weight that held me back and was slowing me down. And I was now focused on what I could do, and I could endure longer, and I could persevere longer at it. That's how we bring our bodies into subjection, by denying them their carnal desires. And as we deny our bodies their carnal desires, we gain just a little bit more discipline and a little bit more endurance to carry us on down the path. That's why we say that the Christian life is a struggle. It's one that we fight each and every day, bringing our carnal natures into subjection to our spiritual will. Now, Christ enables us to do that, but He calls upon us to make that effort, to respond to what He has already done in us. So I bring my body into submission by denying its carnal desires, and as I do this, I grow in my discipline and I grow in my endurance. Now, the fourth key. We run in faith by imitating the example of Jesus. So we are not left to our own devices to figure this out on our own, but instead we have someone to look to, someone to focus on, an example to follow. What a critical thing in running a race, having an example to follow, to see where the path leads, to see how it should be run, to see how it ends. We have the example of Jesus who ran the race before us to look to. He is the one that we look to and the one that we follow. And that's what the passage in verse 2 begins with. Look to Jesus. He is the one that we are to focus on because He is our example. The entire book of Hebrews is focused on this fact, that Jesus is greater. He is superior than all others. So we look to Him as our example because He is the best example. He is superior to everything else. And we focus on Him as our goal in running. Not because we're going to win him. We don't gain Jesus at the end. We have Jesus in the beginning. He's the one who set us on this course. But the way he ran the race is what we look to. The way he lived out our faith is what we look to. The way he completed his race is what we look to. We imitate his example in all that we do. We ran as he ran. We run because he has run the trail before us. I don't want to just run this race on my own, but I want to run it like Jesus ran it. Because he is the best example and he is the perfect example. So we imitate the example of Jesus who pioneered our race. In verse 2, the writer calls him the founder of our faith. Some of your translations say the author. He is the one who came first. I think perhaps a better interpretation is a pioneer. He is the one who pioneered our faith. He ran the course first. He figured out all the shortcuts, where the best ways to go, the shortest distances, the safest travel paths. He blazed that trail before you and I. He pioneered that faith for us. God sent Jesus from heaven on a mission in this earth. In faith, Christ came and he carried out what God the Father called him to do. He walked this trail before you and I. He left heaven to come here and to blaze that trail for us so that we might have an example to follow. He ran the course. And we are not blazing a new trail on our own, but we are rather following the one who pioneered it for us. Somebody has already laid it out. Somebody has already set the course. They've laid the markers. They've told us where the turns and the hazards are. Jesus has done all of that for us, and therefore we can look to him as our example. So he pioneered our race. And then thirdly, he is the one who perfected our course. And he is also not only the author of our faith, but he is the perfecter of it as well. He is the finisher. He is the one who completed our faith, the Bible tells us. He does it for us. Jesus completed the course perfectly, the Bible tells us. In Hebrews 4:15, just a few chapters earlier, we read this. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. He came before us. He went on ahead of us. He was tempted and tried in every way, just as you are, just as I am, but he did it perfectly. He did not sin. He made no mistakes. What other example could we possibly look to that would be greater than the example of the one who did it perfectly? He is the one we look to because he does it perfectly. He finishes the race for us, and we follow him step by step by step. We put our feet in his footsteps. I can remember when one of my children was very young and they saw my tracks in the snow. They would follow me to get through the snow by stepping in my footsteps. Because if they stepped in their own, the snow would come up to their knees almost. But by stepping in my footsteps, they had a clearer path. That's what Christ calls us to do in the Christian life, is to follow him step by step, putting our feet in his footsteps. And by that, we are protected, and we are directed, and we find the path to where we're supposed to be going. We're not looking for a new course out there, people. It's not a new course. We're not trying to blaze a new trail. We're not doing any of those. We're following Jesus as he ran the perfect race. You know, over 100 years ago, Henry Ford pioneered a number of different manufacturing processes for the automobile industry. A number of those processes, he created the assembly line, which we're still using today, making automobiles affordable for nearly every American. You want to know the interesting thing about Henry Ford? 100 and some odd years later, we're still using many of the same processes that he pioneered over 100 years ago. And in our age of technology and advancement, that is saying something. We're saying that what Henry Ford did has never been surpassed. He perfected those processes from the very beginning to the point where we still utilize them today in automobile manufacturing. 2,000 years ago, Christ came to the earth and he lived out and he pioneered the process that we use in living the Christian life. He not only pioneered it, but he perfected it for us to where we are still following him step by step by step. We're not blazing any new trails in the Christian life. Jesus set the course for us as it is. What we are called to do is to follow him. Follow him one step at a time. No one did it before him. No one has done it better than him. Our responsibility is not to create a new course, but it is to faithfully follow the course that was set for us by Jesus. Looking to his example, focusing on him, and bringing our lives into conformity with who he is and what he has done. So then finally, the fifth key to running the Christian life is this. We run in faith by the enabling grace that Jesus has earned for us. Get that. We don't do it on our own. God hasn't left us to our own devices, our own wisdom, or our own ingenuity. We do it by the power of the enabling grace that Christ has earned for us. He's done this in several ways. He has earned it for us through his sacrifice. In verse 2, we see that who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross and despising the shame. Why did Jesus come and blaze this trail of faith? Why was he obedient to the Father? What was the goal or the prize that he was looking toward? It was the joy of being exalted to the right hand of the Father. It was the exaltation to glory that brought Jesus to the earth in the first place. He came and he died for us. He suffered for us. He sacrificed for us in order to obtain a greater recognition. It was the exaltation in glory to the right hand of the Father. That joy was set before him. All runners who run in a race have their focus on a prize, whatever it may be. For some, it's a blue ribbon. For others, it's a trophy. For some, it's just completing the race, just getting to the finish line. Whatever it is, but as each of us run in the race of life, we have a focus on a prize as well. And Christ's focus was the exaltation that was due him in glory because of the suffering and the sacrifice that he endured on our part. That exaltation of Christ required a sacrifice. Philippians 2, 5, and 6 tells us what? It says that Jesus did not account equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but rather he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Taking on human flesh, he came to earth and he stood in our place and he died on our behalf on a cross. He made the sacrifice for us in order to win us the grace to come back into relationship with God the Father. It is his grace that was earned at the cross that brings us to salvation, that brings us into relationship with God, and that enables us to run this course that we have been set upon. We don't do it in our own power. We don't do it in our own strength. We only do it because he has enabled us to do so through his sacrifice. By way of obtaining glory, Jesus has made a way for the rest of us to complete this course as well. Had he not come, we never could have run this course. We were doomed. We were eternally doomed. But because he came, and because he faithfully executed this course, he won for us the grace that enables us to run it. In effect, we have become the prize for Jesus. He ran the race. He executed the race in order to be exalted in glory to the right hand of the Father. But in so accomplishing that, he made a way for each and every one of us to be saved. And you have to think that every time one of us comes to faith, every time one of us appropriates that grace that brings us to salvation, it has to be like another little medal for Jesus. Another little blue ribbon for Jesus. It is his enabling grace that allows us to do this at all. So we see his enabling grace that he has earned for us through his sacrifice, but also through his suffering. What did he come here to do? He endured the cross. The very instrument of pain, suffering, and humiliation he endured on our behalf. He came and stood in our place. He took our punishment in order that we could be enabled in order to come into relationship with God through that grace that he earned for us. He stood in our place as a substitute. He despised the shame of it, the Bible says. He came and he endured the cross, but he despised the shame of it. He didn't accept what it was. It was an instrument of pain, humiliation, and death. But he despised it. He rejected it, instead recognizing it for what it was. It was the instrument that would be used to accomplish our salvation. Christ would deliver us through the pain and the suffering of the cross. And he despised that shame. He rejected what it was. And instead, he accomplished for us that which we could not do on our own. So through his suffering, we have been enabled, but also through his session at the right hand of God, we have received the enabling grace in order to run this race that we call the Christian life. The very end of verse 2 says this, and he, Christ, is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He is seated. Why? In the Bible, being seated always pictures completed work. When a job was completed, a king would sit down. When a task was completed, someone would sit down. When a warrior had won a battle, they would sit down. It is a picture of completed work. The fact that the author to the Hebrews communicates to us that Jesus is now seated at the right hand of the Father at the throne of God indicates to us that he has accomplished the purpose for which he came. He has accomplished the purpose for which he came. That also should indicate to us that we should recognize that the work of salvation is also complete. What Christ came to do, what he came to accomplish, has been done. He came to make a way in order for us to be restored and to be reconciled back to God. And he has accomplished that work. And he is now seated at the hand of the Father. He has completed, he has finished, he has accomplished all that needs to be done. So, Christian, we need to recognize that we can no longer say that the race is too hard, it is too difficult, it is fraught with too much peril, it is too complicated. Jesus has run the race for us. He has enabled us to complete the race, to accomplish the race, and to reach the finish line. We don't have to do it in our own strength or in our own power because he has done it for us. His grace drags us along. It pulls us along. It forces us to the finish line. He will accomplish this for us. Because he ran it before us, we can follow him on that course. Because he was there first, we can now follow him in his footsteps as he enables us to do so. Our responsibility then is to appropriate and utilize what Christ has done for us. He has accomplished it, but we must appropriate it. We must be willing to follow. We must be willing to appropriate that grace that has been offered through the sacrifice and the suffering of Christ and appropriate it in our lives in order to accomplish and to complete the race. Running in faith is a lifelong marathon. We have to remember that. It is a lifelong marathon. It is not a sprint. It is not a dash. And we must pace ourselves and we must exercise discipline in order to complete that race. Otherwise, we will fail. But, fortunately, we have the encouragement of those who've gone on before us. We can look to their example and look to their testimony of how they ran the race before. And they serve as an encouragement to those of us who are running the race today. And we have Jesus who pioneered and perfected our faith. He pioneered the course. He set the course for us, and we can now follow in his footsteps to complete what he began. So therefore, then, the impetus now lies on us to discipline ourselves for the race, to bring our carnal nature into subjection to our spiritual will, and to cast off anything that entangles us or holds us back or prevents us from advancing on the course of life. John Stephen Akhwari was a marathon runner from Tanzania who competed in the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, Mexico. Now, the interesting thing about this young man is that his leg was severely injured during the race. But he didn't give up. He didn't quit. He continued to struggle on and fight his way through the course. He eventually finished the race a little over an hour later than the last runner had completed the course. Severely injured, he made it across the finish line. And when he was asked about this after the race, and they said, why didn't you just quit? Why didn't you give up? His answer is very telling here. He says, my country did not send me to Mexico City to start the race. They sent me here to finish. Folks, God didn't send us out into the world to just start a race either. He set us on a course to finish. He is conforming us to the image of Christ throughout our entire lives, and that is a lifelong process that God has set us on. And He intends to finish that in us. He didn't set us just on a course to start, but to finish. Philippians 1:6 tells us that He who began a good work in you is faithful and just to bring it to completion. What God has started in us, He will finish. He will bring us to that finish line. But He calls upon us to join Him in what He is doing, to struggle, to train, to condition, and to persevere on that course of life in order that He may fulfill in us the purposes for which He set us on this course. Let's pray.